Utah Valley University's 29th Annual Martin Luther King Jr. Commemoration Week. And if you haven't had a chance to look at the displays out there, they're amazing. So we appreciate that. I want to first begin by thanking President Jimenez for suggesting today's first speaker, which is President David Wilson from Morgan State University. I also want to take an opportunity to thank the MLK Commemoration Committee, led by Jerome Corelli of UVU's African Diaspora Initiative, and the Office of the First Year Experience. They've done a great job and a lot of work, so let's please give them a round of applause. I am honored this morning to share with you some highlights, and when I mean some highlights, the list is long, right? From President Wilson's career and his life. President Wilson is the 10th inaugurated president of Morgan State University, which is Maryland's preeminent public urban research university. And for over a decade, Dr. Wilson has not only been a transformative president at Morgan, but he's also emerged as a leader among university presidents nationwide. He's an effective advocate for historically Black colleges and universities and the role they played in developing leaders. Dr. Wilson has a long record of accomplishments in his more than 30 years in higher education administration, and he serves on many influential boards of directors. In 2010, he was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve on the board of advisors of HBCUs. Some of his recognitions include Maryland's Senate First Citizen Award and the Transcendent Order of the African Eagle Award, named as Baltimore Business Journal Top 10 CEO, Baltimore Sun Business and Civic Hall of Famer, and one of Maryland's Daily Records Power 30 in higher education. Dr. Wilson received his bachelor's degree in political science and master's degree in education from Tuskegee University, and master's and doctorates in education from Harvard University. President Jimenez shared with us a video last June that she requested Dr. Wilson to make on her behalf for a K-16 retreat as an inspirational message. And if you haven't had a chance to watch it, it's worth watching. In watching the video, one of the things that really impressed me personally the most was Dr. Wilson's authenticity, his pioneer spirit, his transparency. And he has a one-sentence, unforgettable line where he self-describes himself as, "I'm just a turtle on a stump." So if you want to know, that means you have to ask him or watch the video. So please put your hands together with me in giving him a warm Wolverine welcome to UVU and to Utah for President Wilson.
Good morning. Good morning. It is indeed an honor and a privilege, a pleasure for me to be here this morning at Utah Valley University. As I was making my way to this campus, I almost stopped 4 or 5 times this morning because the vistas was just so incredible. And so I'm going to remark to President Jimenez that, perhaps I should come out here for a sabbatical and just reduce the stress level. But Dr. Meyer, thank you so very much for those very kind words of introduction. I am indeed honored again this morning to be here on your beautiful campus as you commemorate the life and legacy and impact of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I certainly want to thank President Jimenez for the invitation. The president and I got a chance actually to meet last year at Stanford University during a gathering of university presidents at Stanford that was organized by the D School. And we came together to discuss innovation in higher education and how it could empower the students on our campuses to lead change and to make our campuses more dynamic, more responsive to the student needs, as well as to the needs external to the campus, and hopefully we could produce many, many more leaders in the mold of Dr. King. And so I did hear from the president last night that she had a conflict. I understand. She's doing some very important work in New York, and I was given that opportunity a year or so ago, and you cannot say no to that because we all have to make these connections and develop these collaborations in order to ensure that all of these pathways are open for students to take advantage of them long term. And so we have a connection, Morgan and Utah Valley University. It's a fleeting one, but when the basketball season opened this year, I saw where we had been invited to a tournament, I believe in Jamaica, and I saw that Utah Valley University was also there. I said, well, it would be interesting if we won the first game, and if they won the first game, that we could actually play each other. And so that actually came to be. And Morgan and Utah Valley University played, and I am glued to the screen watching the game. It was an incredible game that actually went into overtime, and of course, Morgan emerged as the victor by only 1 point. But I'm not going to hold that, if you will. And I'm sure that the Wolverine of Utah Valley can't wait for that rematch, and quite frankly, the Morgan the Benny Bear can't wait either. And so what I want to do this morning is actually say a word or two about what I call the unfinished agenda of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And then I would like to end by basically maybe taking the curtain back a little bit more and share with you a little bit more of my own personal journey, as it was really about hearing Dr. King, having lived through some incredible atrocities while growing up in Alabama, and to ask myself, how can you live a life of purpose, a life of meaning, to address all of these challenges that you see in front of you? And so, as the nation gathered earlier this week to celebrate the remarkable difference that Dr. King made during his life, so many of those celebrations of Dr. King were permeated with warm remembrances of his renowned "I Have a Dream" speech made in 1963. It's almost as if we have reduced Dr. King to "I Have a Dream." But we gathered in warm remembrance of that. Since, of course, that time, 1963, generations of Americans warmly now refer to Dr. King as simply an incurable optimist and simply a dreamer. But I share with you this morning that Dr. King was much, much more than that. Yes, Dr. King most assuredly had his fair share of critics and cynics who attributed his dream to what they called, quote, a perverted form of somewhat juvenile naivete that prevented him from blindly seeing and accepting a racially divided world as it is. But what these detractors didn't realize was that Dr. King dwelled in the realm of possibilities. He rejected, quote, descriptive reality. And descriptive reality is simply seeing the world as it was. He rejected that. And he focused instead on normative reality, meaning seeing the world in the vernacular as it ought to be. Yes, he was undeniably a dreamer, but his dream was not the product of a passive imagination, or simply a poetic retreat from the ugliness, the brutalities, and the injustices that bedeviled American society in the 1950s and the 1960s. As Dr. King so often reminded us, through all of the cacophony, through all of the trials, through all of the tribulations, he reminded us that there's nothing wrong with our great nation that is not redeemable. What I'm saying to you this morning is that Dr. King chose to light a candle. He did not choose to merely curse the darkness. He saw optimism, not pessimism. He saw opportunity, and he challenged us not to accept our beloved America as it presented itself to us, but to dream bigger and to imagine what that would look like when achieved. I am often reminded of Dr. King's keen sense of the historical moment. And I often say to my students at Morgan that there's a difference between a moment and an era. And if you understand the moment can become an era, but moments in and of themselves don't. And Dr. King understood this moment facing America, and he had the wherewithal to stitch together so many other moments and to make that an era of unbelievable transformation. He was not afraid, the least bit, to speak truth to power. He had a firm grasp of the challenges, of the social responsibilities of people from all walks of life who shared that optimism, who shared this notion of not seeing America as it merely was, but as it ought to be. And these individuals, they knew that they were up against everything, but they were willing to struggle. They were willing to sacrifice in every one of those moments everything, even their own lives, to make America what it ought to be. Dr. King clearly understood, better than most, that the need for struggle, the need for constructive protest, the need to sacrifice, he understood that these things were unfortunately necessary and unavoidable if indeed the nation was going to change. Here's the way he put it, and I'm quoting him. He said, quote, "Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but change comes through continuous struggle. Human progress," he says, "is neither automatic or inevitable. Each step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, and that is the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals." And so in essence, change is not going to come, he says, by our just simply wishing it will. No, it's not going to roll in on the wheels of inevitability. We have to be very purposeful in advocating for, struggling for, and sacrificing for that change. Now, as we all know, Dr. King was tragically assassinated at the age of 39 and did not live to see many aspects of what he really was dreaming about to come to fruition. But his work has most assuredly left an indelible mark on our national psyche, and of equal importance, his work has changed the face and functioning of American democracy well into the 21st century. His dream remains an unfinished agenda today, but his brief sojourn on this earth was not without its single victories, particularly in the area of voting rights. Now, in my judgment, the slow grinding of American democracy has entailed an elongated process of extending the franchise of voting to minorities and to women, when so many citizens long ago thought that that fundamental right to vote should be extended to white men only. Now today, that position seems almost ridiculous. But as so many historians and political scientists have pointed out, America truly did not become a fully functioning democracy until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the act that Dr. King and countless others fought for with their collective blood, sweat, tears, and deaths. Now, of course, that sacred right to vote was presumably extended to African Americans and to other citizens with the ratification of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution in 1870. But as history teaches us, that federal decree was not upheld at every turn by state legislatures, particularly those in the American South, and particularly that one in my own state of Alabama. Those states refused to uphold that law, and they basically subverted it, and they did not allow blacks to vote. And when they did, as was the case in my home state, what they put in place was just absolutely unbelievable. My father did not vote until 15 years before his death. My mom did not. And that was because they would say, well, you know, you can't vote unless you own property. Well, because my parents were sharecroppers. They didn't own any property. They lived on the property owned by whites in Alabama. Oh, you know, but if you make your way down to the poll here, you know, we're going to have this jar of jelly beans, and you have to answer two questions. How many jelly beans are in the jar? And then how many black ones? And if you can't get those right, then we're sorry, but you cannot vote, right? So it was these kind of ridiculous kinds of things, and then all of a sudden, you know, that became a bit violent. But here, you know, I'm reminded of the words of former President Barack Obama, who perceptively noted that we are on a never-ending journey to bridge the meaning of our distinctively American ideals with the reality of our times. As he stated, our American truths, the TRUTHS, they may be self-evident, and our rights may be unalienable, but, quote, history tells us that while these truths may be self-evident, they are never, ever self-executing. In that while freedom, he says, is a gift from God, it must be secured by his people here on earth, if indeed we are going to live it. Thus, it seems to me that we are obliged to actively defend the right of all citizens to vote and all citizens to participate in our cherished and hard-won democracy. I mentioned this during this commemorative celebration because, in my view, having lived the life that I have lived, having woven in and out of so many spaces in this country, the White House, I must have been there 15 times, all over the world, having met all kinds of leaders, from Nelson Mandela in South Africa, spent some incredible time there, to leaders in India, and all over the world. I see some clear signs and irrefutable evidence of some retrogression and some reversal in this space in our beloved country. You would have to be in a deep Rip Van Winkle-like sleep not to recognize that sad reality. The sacred right to vote is clearly under attack as various states increasingly imagine and then subsequently enact laws that actually create barriers to voter registration, barriers to voter participation in our democracy. You know, several years before Dr. King, the eminent scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, he warned African Americans in particular that, quote, the power of the ballot, he said, we need in sheer defense, else we shall not be saved from a second slavery. And so everyone, all the prominent scholars looking in on this period is saying, now let's awaken, if we are in that Rip Van Winkle-like sleep, and let's understand what it really means to be a fully functioning democracy where we are encouraging and making it easier for all of our citizens to have a voice and to participate fully. That really is what Dr. King was advocating. He was not advocating marginalization. He was advocating full participation. And that is basically what I'm seeing now. And so, believe me, voting is not a right that most of us take for granted. I vote in everything. And that's what I would advise you to do, right? I vote in, if I live in a community, and if I live in a condo, and I just go downstairs for the meeting, I'm going to vote. I need to know what's going on. I want to make my voice, because, you know, I understand what it means not to participate. And so I think when you do that, you are honoring Dr. King. Today, the stakes are high. Our ability to vote will profoundly influence the direction of our nation, where it's going, and I think it will define the nature of our national character well into the 21st century and beyond. And to say that we are at an inflection point would be a gross understatement. Consider the ominous signs all around us. I cannot come here today and not speak truth to power. And so last year, we witnessed a full-scale attack on our nation's capital in an effort to disrupt the peaceful transfer of presidential power. A year later, those who planned and executed that effort, many of them have been charged with outright sedition. Since the 2020 presidential election, 19 states have passed legislation which impact voting rights, primarily impacting the poor, the aged, and minorities. And in the meantime, other states are seeking ways in which they can suppress the vote. And this is, in my view, not the recipe for what Dr. King was fighting for. So worst of all, many of you perhaps have not heard of a recent poll, but let me share it with you. A recent poll indicated that 58% of Americans believe that our American democracy is in danger of collapse, while the alleged perpetrators of the Capitol insurrection promulgate the alarming and unthinkable proposition that we may be headed toward a second civil war. Ladies and gentlemen, as my dearly departed friend and former member of the Morgan Board of Regents, the late Elijah Cummings, noted, we are better than that. We are better than that. And let me add, we are much, much, much better than that. And we must keep that in front of us. And so, what I want to leave you with this morning is that I have understood all too well what Dr. King died for. I have understood all too well what Rosa Parks stood for. I have understood all too well Bloody Sunday in Selma, because that was my backyard. And so just a little bit of my background as to why I feel I have the right and the obligation to speak the way I speak and to lead the way I lead. I am the youngest of 10 children, the first in my family to go to college. Now, this is on that video that Dr. Meyer spoke about. But I grew up in what they call abject poverty in rural Alabama. Abject poverty. What that means is that my family rarely had 2 Lincoln pennies to rub together. And so we lived on a sharecropping plantation. So for the individuals in the audience who perhaps haven't heard that term, that was really what happened, if you will, after the Civil War, where whites, basically, the landowners, still made their land available to the newly freed slaves in the South, but said, okay, but you know what, you can work the land and then we'll share in the profits. Of course, there were never, ever, ever any profits, right? And so you just got deeper and deeper and deeper in debt. And so even if someone got, whatever, the quote-unquote big head, and said, well, I'm going to move my family off of this. Well, Mr. X or Mrs. X would say, well, in this case, Henry, my father, well, okay, so now you owe us $120,000. I can't even say $120,000, right? So you have to pay us that before you leave. So it was just this system that kind of kept people really in slavery. That was me. And I didn't get a chance to go to school 5 days a week during the harvest season because my father had a system in place where he would keep us out of school 3 days 1 week, and we can go 2, and then he would reverse it the next week. And so I was in the 7th grade before I attended school 5 consecutive days. Now, my first 5 brothers, of course, they succumbed to that system immediately, and all of them dropped out in the first few months of the 1st grade. And so all of them were and are illiterate to this day, the ones that are living. When I was allowed to go to school, I went to something called a Rosenwald school. And for the young people in the audience, you might want to Google that, Rosenwald, like Rosenwald. Those were these one-room shanties that were built primarily on black church grounds, and they had 6 classes in one room, much like Little House on the Prairie, with one teacher. And that was my early education, in a building like that with one teacher, the late Mrs. Elijah Hertz. The little shanty that I grew up in there was one where we had no electricity, no plumbing, nothing, if you will. My mom and dad and all of us in 2 rooms. And so the whites who owned the land understood that my mom was very, very creative and very, very innovative. And she would always have to figure out, how am I going to keep my family warm in the winter? And they brought down Look and Life magazines. And she knew the late Mrs. Vita Murray, who was the patriot of that owner legacy there. And she said, well, Leslie, here are some magazines, and I know that you and the children will plaster them against these walls, and you can keep the wind out. And that's what we did. We would get home from picking cotton, and my mom would have something over here on this wooden stove, that flour and water that she would have boiled, and it became a starch. And we put our hands in that and plastered those pages on the walls of the shanty to keep the cold wind out. Well, you know what happened? When I got home from picking cotton all day, I would grab a kerosene lamp, and I would go around the walls of that little shanty, and I started to learn how to read. And I began to read about all of these places in the world that were fascinating. It's like, wow, you mean there's a place out there that really, really looks like that? I can't wait to experience it. And so I'd like to say that I went all over the world in that little shanty without ever leaving it. And that is when I began to understand the magical powers of education. And I wanted to taste it. And so on one day in the 6th grade, when I was in school, my 6th grade teacher, the late Mrs. Luvinia Abernathy Coates, who is the sister of the late Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, who, Reverend Abernathy, was Dr. King's major deputy. So Mrs. Abernathy Coates said to me, David, can you come up to my desk after school? I have something I want to say to you. I said, sure, Mrs. Coates. And so I went up to her desk, and she said, look, I want you to go home and tell your father something for me. And I said, yes, ma'am, what do you want me to tell him? And she said, I want you to tell him that if he could figure out a way to send you to school 5 days a week, I think you can go to college. Whoa. That was the first time I'd ever heard the word college. And so I raced home, and I was so excited. And I said, well, Daddy, Mrs. Coates told me to tell you something. And he said, boy, what is it? I said, well, she wanted me to tell you that if you could figure out a way to send me to school 5 days a week, I could go to college. And you know what he said? He said, boy, let me tell you something. He said, college is for white people. That was what my father told me. And we never talked about it again. And then 5 years passed. We had moved out of the shanty. Now we're in, quote unquote, the house that we call our house today. The family house is standing there in rural Alabama, Ringo County, empty. It's a step up from a shanty, but not far. And I only applied to one university because, in my view, it was the best university in the nation. It was Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. That was the only institution I applied to. And to this day, I cannot explain why they accepted me. I had an SAT score of 560. 560. I don't know what the total was at the time, but it couldn't have been far from 1,600. Right? But they saw something in me, in the way that I presented myself in that application, that said to them, this young man is worth an investment. And they brought me there, and they put me in this program called the Freshman Studies Program, which meant what? That I had some work to do, because I had lost a lot of time from school. But they believed in me. And so now, I get a little ahead of myself here. So it's August 26, as I recall, 1973. And I rose early in this house to get ready to go to Tuskegee. We didn't have a car, and the only way I could get there was to get a ride with the parents of one of my high school classmates who also was going to Tuskegee. And they said to me, well, David, we're taking Lucy to Tuskegee, and we're taking her in our pickup truck. And so we have no space on the inside for you, but you're welcome to go, but you got to sit on the back. And I said, fine. So I had my one little bag of, I have 2 pair of jeans and a couple of T-shirts. And as I'm about to go out the door to meet them in the front yard, I heard someone get up in the adjacent room, and it was my father. And he came into the front room. It was about 5:30 or so in the morning. And he had on these overalls. The picture is just so powerful in my mind. One strap was attached, the other one was loose across his shoulder. And he said, David, he called me by my name. He said, son, he said, you are about to do something that no one in this family has ever done. He said, you're about to go to college. He said, now, do you recall that 5 years ago, you told me you wanted to go to college? I said, well, yes, Daddy, I do. Because it was so painful, I said to him. And he said, well, let me tell you what I was really thinking. He said, what I was really thinking was, how in the hell will I ever pay for you to go to college. He said, but you know, I saw in you so much determination. And I started saving. He said, I started saving for the day when I would see my little David go out that front door to college. He said, son, hold out your hand. And I held out my hand. And he put his hands in his overalls. And he pulled out something. He said, now I've been saving this piece of money for you. And he put it in my hand. And then he put his hand over my hand. And he said, now, this is all that I have. I want you to make the best of this. And I looked into his face, and he was crying. That was the first time I had ever seen my father cry. And I said, Daddy, I'll make the best of it. And when I opened the front door and the sun was coming up and the pickup truck was waiting for me in the yard, and I looked in my hand, there was a crisp $5 bill. That was all that he had been able to save for 5 years to send me to college. I'm a turtle on a stump. A lot of hands have gone into the making of who I am, and to lead me to a point where I can say to Dr. King and to all of those who gave everything, their lives, that you didn't do that in vain. I have an obligation. My students at Morgan, as long as I'm there, will forever know that they have an obligation, that they are the future, and my expectation is that they will lead the world. So as I was being inaugurated there, October 21st of 2010, and I stayed up all night writing my speech, and I got up and I started delivering it. I heard my late father in my ear, and he said, that's not the speech you should be delivering. It's time for you to pay me back on my investment in you. I couldn't get him out of my ear. And so I made the first of many gifts to Morgan. I made a gift of $100,000 initially to establish the $5 scholarship program in honor of my late father. And that program now is, I know, about $1.6 million, and we use the investments there to provide opportunities for students who are not too dissimilar from their president to taste the magic of education. I thank you again for inviting me here this morning as we honor the life and legacy of Dr. King. I just say to all of us here at this incredible university, let us commit ourselves to doing the right thing, to perfecting our democracy, to understanding that the things that hold us together as a people across so many spaces are powerful. Let's commit ourselves to unification, not division. And let's commit ourselves to forging a more perfect union and to holding our nation to the ideals embedded in our Constitution, that indeed all people are created equal and should enjoy equal rights and equal opportunities. Thank you very much, Utah Valley State University. Thank you. Utah Valley University, I should say. Thank you very much.
Dr. Wilson. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Now's the time for the question and answer period. Since we are live streaming, we ask people come up to the microphones so that they can hear you on the live stream. So we have about 10 minutes if anyone has any questions.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, I can.
I guess I'll be brave and be the first one. Dr. Wilson, thanks for coming and such wonderful words. I think I get a little bit concerned when I go to fill out applications, anything that has any kind of, to have to say age, gender, race, things like that. I actually went to a Social Security office and it had a place where it wanted your race on it and things like that. I can see where age might be a situation, but I would like to know if there's some way that we can stop that and maybe even start lawsuits, things like that, for things that, for applications, things like that, that shouldn't even be asking those questions on people. As long as we do that, we're gonna still have problems and divisions in our country, so.
Thank you very much for the commentary and the question. The way I look at it, I prefer to see it as an effort to describe our population and to just simply get a sense of the level of representation across the great diversity that we have in our country. And so that's the way that I prefer to look at questionnaires that actually have those kinds of checking of boxes. Now, I have to also say to you that because we have, we've seen this at Morgan, because we have such diversity amongst the student population. We have about 9,500 students at Morgan, representing 45 states and 60 countries. And we have also many students who prefer not to check one box, right? Because they are multi-ethnic, multi-racial, and so that piece, if you will, just, it was amazing. The number of students just decided that they were not going to check any box at all. We did see that last year for the very, very first time. So we are listening to what our students in particular are saying to us without necessarily articulating it, and then always looking at ways in which we can improve.
Good morning, Dr. Wilson.
Good morning.
I'm Betty Walston Sawyer. I'm MSU class of 75. Oh, wow. So yes, I would not let this day pass without letting you know that there are folk in Utah that are part of that legacy that you talked about. And in speaking of that legacy, you mentioned a couple of touch points along the way where significant people stood up and took a chance with you and encouraged you. How important is that today as we see what's going on across our country?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. And is that Delta Sigma Theta?
It sure is.
Yeah. Is that Alpha Delta?
No, I'm Greater Salt Lake alum.
Okay, very good, very good. So yeah, this is just an inside story here. And so I think it's extraordinarily important for all of us to be there supporting individuals who are so talented, and sometimes they just don't understand it. And so I say all the time that the greatest joy of my career now has been being president of Morgan State. And so I was the vice president at Auburn University in Alabama for 11 years, the first black in the history of the state of Alabama ever to be vice president of a predominantly white institution. I was the associate provost at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and before I came to Morgan, I was a chancellor within the University of Wisconsin system and oversaw 13 of their liberal arts campuses and Wisconsin Public Television, Wisconsin Public Radio, all of that. However, what I have found at Morgan is purpose. I have found a way that Dr. King spoke about to speak to why I can do 15-hour days and not be tired, right? And here it is. As I walk the campus every single day and I meet so many students, I stay in a conversation with them, try to, long enough, where in a very genuine way, one would say something to me where I can legitimately say to that student, you know, that's the most innovative, thoughtful comment I have ever heard. And the student would say, Dr. Wilson, but I said that. I said, yes, say it again. I said, that's what I said. That was the most genuine, thoughtful comment that I've ever heard. Have a great day. And so when I turn, almost 8 times out of 10, that student will stand there momentarily for about 3 or 4 seconds saying, well, wait, the president just said that what I just said was brilliant. And then they walk away just presenting themselves differently, right? And so what I see every single day is so many young people who are dripping in brilliance, and they don't know it. And our responsibility is to do what Dr. King did, to light a candle and not curse the fact that they don't know. They don't know it because in many instances, some of them, 25% of my students are first-generation college-going students. And they didn't grow up the way my son grew up. You know, we were telling him the moment he was conceived how great he was going to be. Had no idea. Well, you're going to, great. And so he came to Morgan, and I had to have a conversation with him because he thought he was all that. When in essence, I love my son. We have a great relationship. So, but I have to say to him, now you think you're all that, and you might not necessarily be it. But here's a student over here who does not think that he or she is all that, and they are. And you got to really bring those two things together. So, yes, continue to be mentors, continue to connect with individuals where you can see hope. You see a future. You see in them some things that they don't see in themselves, and then you bring them to that brilliance. I think that's very important. And there's no way that I would be here without that. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for sharing your story. If I'm remembering correctly, the timeline, you started college in 1973, yes. So it's like right after the fallout of the civil rights era, Martin Luther King's assassination, Malcolm X's assassination,
yes,
Black Panthers. I'm really interested to find out how the fallout of the civil rights era really affected you or impacted you, whether it motivated you or discouraged you in any way. How did those events inform your experience through college and your young years, your formative years?
Yes. So when I arrived on the campus of Tuskegee, I looked differently. I went out and I bought 2 dashikis, and I had this huge afro, and I didn't realize that I was harboring a little bit of anger, actually with my father. And as I'm taking these college courses now, and I'm trying to kind of get to a level of understanding, it made me just push deeper and deeper and deeper into how did things actually get this way in our country, right? And then I had these amazing professors at Tuskegee, who whoa, I mean, they challenged me in a way that was productive. You know, I had a history professor, I had two of them. You know, the late Frank Tolan and then Willie Fluker. I mean, they just took all of that negative energy and channeled it to an intellectual probity. And so here I am, you know, having grown up at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, and having grown up the way I grew up, and now I'm reading, you know, all of the literature of H. Rap Brown and all of that, but it's giving me perspectives, you know, on what I had lived. So I had a lived experience, and it was not just intellectualizing something. It was taking what was being presented to me intellectually to understand the lived experience, and then how to emerge from that and not be bitter. And so let me close on another story real quickly. I did harbor some anger or bitterness toward my father, because as I'm kind of understanding all of this, and I'm in now on a campus where so many students are upper middle class, and they are wanting me to go home with them on spring break and blah, blah, blah. So I went to all these places, like unbelievable. Well, David, you know, when are you gonna take us home with you? And I never did, because I was embarrassed, right? And so, long story short, years later, I was elected as a W.K. Kellogg International Leadership Fellow. And for 3 years, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation provided me and about 39 other up-and-coming leaders in the United States with an opportunity to go around the world and to meet any world leader that would give us an audience, to learn about different forms of leadership, to learn about different cultures, to learn about different spaces. They did not want us to grow up as leaders and not understand the world. And so we wrote away, and that's when we got the audience with Mr. Mandela, Oliver Tambo in South Africa, Walter Sisulu, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and all of these unbelievable people. But it was a conversation with the late Walter Sisulu, who was one of the founders of the ANC in South Africa, that actually changed my worldview and my relationship with my father, the way I thought about it, and all the constructive stuff. And so we wrote and asked if he would have an audience with us. It was it was 5 young black men, kind of growing up now to be leaders, and he agreed to meet with all of us. So we go down to his little office on Victoria Street in Johannesburg, South Africa at the time. And so we go up very modest, and we had an unbelievable conversation. And we're just taking notes. I have, you know, 3 or 4 legal pads of notes from my conversation with Mr. Sisulu. And so after that conversation, we left and went back to our combines where we were staying, because at the time, the hotels in South Africa would not allow us to stay. They would not allow blacks to stay in the hotels. And we stayed up all night. And we were debating whether this unbelievable conversation that we just had with Mr. Sisulu, Sisulu, Walter Sisulu, whether he harbored any anger or any bitterness toward the society that locked him away for 27 years. So he was locked away right with Nelson Mandela for 27 years. And his only crime was that he was anti-apartheid. That was it, right? And so we said, well, we misread him. Surely he is angry. Surely he is bitter. And we decided that we could not fly from South Africa back to the United States without asking Mr. Sisulu that question directly. So we called his office that morning, and his secretary answered the phone, his administrative assistant, and we said, we just have to come back and see. But he gave you all this time yesterday. Just 15 more minutes, please. And he agreed. And we rushed up to his office, and we sat around his very modest round table, and he came in and he said, now I'm going to quote him. He said, comrades, he said, my assistant told me that I sent you away thinking yesterday. He said, thinking is a very good thing. So as you go back to America, you understand that, right? That's lesson number one. He said, now what can I do for you? We said, well, Mr. Sisulu, we stayed up all night wondering whether you are angry or bitter toward the white South African society that locked you away for 27 years when you had committed no crime. That's what we want to know. And he paused for about 5 to 6 seconds, and he said, I harbor no anger or bitterness toward the society that locked me away for 27 years, of which 8 of those years were in solitary confinement, because I knew then, I know now, and I would know until the last breath leaves my body that what I did and what I will continue to do is and will forever be the right thing. And so, my future leaders, as you ascend in leadership roles, if you commit to always do the right thing, there should never ever be any room in your heart for anger or bitterness. And I called my father and just let him know that I'd had this kind of transformation. And I forgave him for not having put us in a different kind of position, because now I'm kind of understanding the world and all of the trappings and the structures that were in place that simply prevented certain things from happening, and you do not have to emerge from that as a bitter soul. All right? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much again.
Can we give Dr. Wilson another round of applause? Thank you so much for being with us here at Utah Valley University. Your stories are really impactful, especially the one about your father. I felt that in many ways personally. I want everybody to know that we also have a scholarship here at Utah Valley University. It's not $5, a little bit more, but if you want to learn more about that opportunity to give to our students, our Black students, students of the African diaspora, there's a table. Those folks in the back can give you some information about that. And if you feel so moved, you can donate to that scholarship. I also want everybody to, on your way out, please take another look at the visuals exhibit in the back. And can we give a round of applause for Cassie Bingham from the Center for Social Impact and Deborah Coleman for helping to put that together. And I also see some leaders here, Ms. Emma Houston and Ms. Betty Sawyer. They're some of the OGs in our community, as well as Dr. Diane McAdams-Jones. Our struggle has always been spearheaded by Black women who don't always get the recognition. So please give them a round of applause. Can you stand up, Ms. Betty and Dr. Diane? Can you guys stand? Okay. If you will be attending the brunch, it's invitation only. You just go out here and take a left, and you'll see it down on the left. And everybody else, please come back at 12 p.m. We're gonna have Anthony Ray Hinton here, and he's gonna speak from 12 to 1, and then we'll have a book signing in center stage at 1 o'clock, and then student-led breakout sessions from 2 to 4 and SC 206. So thank you all for being here.